Before we get started on a particular subject, maybe you've got a question on something. Maybe there's something we've been discussing or something you've been studying in your own studies you've got a question on. Okay, I see a couple in a row. Go ahead.
I was wondering that the bride that reigns during the millennial reign, okay, after that 1,000 years is finished, what will they do then? Will they be reigning and judging during the resurrection?
The Bible doesn't give us that I have ever found any details of what the bride or the Jewish ministry will be doing during the 8th day, during the period after the second resurrection. I would assume they would be at the core of the work to work with the individuals that come up in the second resurrection. I would assume they'd be at the core of that. It's one of those subjects that we went through fairly exhaustively and then stopped on it and have held back to decide if we want to get into the second resurrection. We talked in a lot of detail about the first, and mainly because that's what I think we should be striving for. We shouldn't be striving for anything but the first resurrection. But the second resurrection is a very interesting subject, and possibly one of these days we'll get into it. But that would be related to what you're talking about, Sister Wilma, because the millennial reign will be over. The millennial reign ends, and then the second resurrection begins. It's the next phase of God's plan. And what part will they have? The only thing that is very specific about their role is related to the millennial reign. It says they'll live and reign with Christ and they'll act as priests for, that's 20th chapter of Revelation, for 1,000 years. Does that mean that they will cease operating in a leadership capacity after 1,000 years and just become part of the brotherhood in a general sense? Or does that mean they'll still be at the core of the leadership on into the 8th day when there's individuals still need to be dealt with? I would think as long as there are individuals that need to be dealt with, they'll probably be at the core center of that leadership. The issue of the ruling and reigning with Christ is specific to bringing the world into the order it's supposed to be in. Once that job is done, that doesn't mean the issue of salvation is over. It just means that the world has been brought back into its right relationship with God. I'm talking about the governments of the world. The structure and order and the systems have been corrected. That's what their main job is. But I don't think because that's their main job, that's their only role. I think they're also at the very height of the economy of God's government. And thus, in the 8th day, I would think they would be at the very core of dealing with individuals. If that answers the question. Somebody else back there, I think, Larry?
When Cain slew Abel, I've heard it said that Cain and Abel was twins. And one of the things that might back that up is God told Cain that he was of his father, the devil. So, to me, that means they had two different daddies.
Well, I've heard that view too. That isn't my view, but I've heard that view. There is a statement not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, that Cain was of the wicked one, is how the New Testament says it. I think that the language used there is the exact kind of language you'd use if someone has influenced you to become a part of their party, or they've influenced you to go along with their way of thinking. That they have become a father to you, just like Paul said to Timothy that he was a father to him in the gospel, my son Timothy. Well, he didn't physically produce Timothy.
Jesus made that statement, you are of your father the devil. He's talking to a lot of people there.
Now there's where I would go to another New Testament passage, the 8th chapter, where Jesus makes that statement about how you are of your father the devil, and they were claiming to be of Abraham. Now that's a deep statement, because technically they were saying we are physically the children of Abraham. They weren't talking about the spiritual realm or the fact that they were the inheritors of Abraham's character. They were just saying, we are the children of Abraham. They meant it physically. They meant we are of the physical lineage of Abraham. And then he said, you're of your father, the devil. Well, if we were to take that literally, he would have had to mean they had been produced, and they were children in a physical sense of the devil. But then he clarified what he meant by that. He said, if you were the children of Abraham, you would do the deeds of Abraham. It's because you're doing the deeds of the devil that you're children of the devil. That's how I take Cain as well. And John made that statement about how Cain was of the wicked one.
We can all be children of the wicked one, according to our lifestyle. We wouldn't be his offspring, but we would be in his likeness. The Bible says we're supposed to be in the likeness of Christ. We can be the likeness of the devil.
Well, you take on the qualities of somebody who is your biological parent, and you take on the qualities of someone that is your spiritual parent.
That's right.
If both of those are synonymous, if I've got 3 children back there, I hope if I am a godly man, they take on not only the fact that I'm their biological father, I hope I can be a spiritual father to them.
Right.
I hope that I can have influence on their thinking, influence on their lives, influence on their choices. That would be how someone could be a spiritual father. That's what Brother Kosa was referencing when Jesus made that statement about how you are of your father, the devil, and his works you'll do. And he made it pretty clear, the reason you know someone is of the devil in that sense is because they are acting like the devil. It's who you act like. It's whose qualities you take on. And I would apply that back to Cain. I'd apply it to anybody that is a seed of the serpent, so to speak. I don't think that it requires a physical, biological process. I think it has to do with somebody planting their seed in your mind. Somebody influencing your thinking, influencing your feelings.
Lifestyle.
Starting where Brother Kosa was at. Now, did somebody find the other one? 1 John 3, where he says,
not as Cain, who
not
was
as
of
Cain.
that wicked one, and slew his brother.
He was of that wicked one. You realize that's the exact same language Jesus used regarding the Jews when he said, you are of your father the devil. I certainly don't believe that whole generation of Jews right there had been biologically fathered by Satan. He made that pretty clear when he went on to say that if you were of your father Abraham, you would do the deeds of Abraham. You'd have the character, the faith, the qualities that Abraham had in his spiritual life. But the qualities you're showing in your spiritual life are devilish qualities. So the person that has fathered you spiritually is the devil. You haven't been produced spiritually by Abraham's faith.
Didn't Jesus call Peter Satan one time?
Yeah, that's actually a good point that would support my statement on this, because I think at that point there was something that was devil-like that was being communicated through Peter's mouth, unfortunately. I don't mean that Peter was the devil, but that's kind of proof that somebody can have those qualities, that being biologically the child of the devil. I doubt seriously Peter would have had the position he had if he had biologically been fathered by the devil. What happened with Peter was one of two things. Here's again one of those one of two things kind of options. Either it came out of Peter's own heart. This would be the view of someone that does, by the way, you could believe this if you believed in a literal devil, but for the individuals that don't believe in a literal devil, they might say this. It just came up out of Peter's fallen nature, and thus that's why Jesus was calling him that. The other side of that coin would be that the devil was speaking through Peter. The devil had influenced Peter's thinking. Because I honestly think that when Jesus said that, "Get behind me, Satan," I'm not 100% sure he was talking just to Peter. Now, he might have been talking to Peter on some indirect way, but I think he realized the source of this statement is Satan. He is influencing Peter to say it. I don't think he took over Peter's vocal cords. I think he influenced Peter to make that statement, very possibly, and it seems to be why Jesus would respond so strong. Seems to me Satan was influencing Peter's thinking. He had put a thought in Peter's mind. If you notice the context of those statements, it isn't something you and I would look at and say, that's terrible, that's wicked, that's evil. Peter didn't want Jesus to have to go through the process Jesus was going to go through. And Jesus wasn't going to be tempted to forego his calling. And so it looks like he was responding to the influencing agent behind Peter.
The plan that God has formulated for man, he's always been against it. And if he can influence somebody to take a stand against that, then that's his calling. And that's what it looks like there. Peter was in sympathy. He didn't want to see the Lord's Supper, but he didn't understand the plan of God. That was part of God's plan for the Lord's Supper.
That's why there's times, Brother Lee, when your emotions, even though they seem to be charitable or proper, or you just care for somebody, what you actually might be doing is more harm than good. There's times people get into a mess, and this isn't always true. Sometimes it's exactly the opposite. But there's times people get into a mess, and the last thing God wants you to do is help them. There's some they need to go through. They need to learn their lesson. Right. And we say, oh, I feel sorry for them. We've got to fix this. I've got to do something to help this person. And you may be stepping on God's toes trying to do it because he may be trying to teach them a lesson. That's one extreme. That wasn't Jesus' case, but God had a purpose for Jesus' life, and Peter didn't understand that purpose, and Peter didn't want Jesus to go through the process. Stephen?
I was reading something on perfection, and he was alluding to 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, where it says, "Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." And from what I could understand from what the writer was saying, it almost seems as though when Christ appears, that those that are resurrected will be glorified or changed officially. But then when I'm looking at this verse, the next verse, the third verse, it says, "And every man that hath this hope in him purifieth himself, even as he is pure."
How does that third verse affect your thinking on the second?
That, of the progressive nature of our drawing closer to the Lord and growing in holiness and that sort. But from what I'm seeing of the writer, and a lot of just the article that I was reading in general, it seemed like he was on the fence on his doctrine of perfection, almost very similar to our belief system, but then he would make statements like this, for this here, for example, where just taking that verse 2, where it says, well, once he appears, then that's the culmination, that's when we're glorified, that's when we're now made perfect.
I was waiting to see if you're going to finish that sentence. You did, so I have to split the sentence now, Stephen. If you wanted to use the first half of that sentence, I'd agree. If you're not. But if this writer wanted to use the second half, I would not agree. I don't think you're made perfect in a moral, listen, this is important to understand the distinction. I don't think you're made perfect in a moral sense by his appearing. I do personally think the second and third verse are talking about a progressive change, that eventually there is a change of the body that is the result of the change of the heart. That's what it comes down to. Any change of a body you're going to receive will be the direct result of a change of the heart. Nobody is going to get a body whose heart hasn't been circumcised and hasn't been made alive to God and hasn't gone through this statement in the third verse, every man that hath this hope in him purifieth himself, even as he is pure. Do you know who the he is there? That's Jesus. We purify ourselves even as Jesus is pure. Now, you want to talk about a statement about perfection. There it is. That's no different than Ephesians 4 when it says the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. We purify ourselves as he is pure, not as the standard of somebody down the road. Oh, that guy over there is pretty righteous. I want to be righteous like that. No. I'm trying to purify myself to be pure like he is. And now notice the language here. It says, every man that hath this hope in himself. What hope? The hope of the resurrection. The point of this is, I have a hope that I want to be changed in a moment, in a twinkle of an eye. Changed from corruptible to incorruptible. Changed from mortal to immortal. For that to happen, I've got to purify myself even as he is pure. That's what I think it means. Because of the hope of the second verse, I'm going to do the work of the third verse. And if I do that work, and God helps me, and God strengthens me, and God finishes the process that's necessary, then I'm going to receive the hope in the second verse. I don't want to get into this real deep unless you have questions on it. But it's interesting to study out the phrase, Son of God, or sons of God. Now, if you're studying out the phrase Son of God in the singular, the Son of God, of course you're talking about Jesus, and that's an entirely different subject than studying out the term sons of God. It doesn't mean that it's different in every way, but there's some things about Jesus that are singular that nobody else has that relationship. That said, though, there are different individuals, different categories of beings that are called sons of God. Angels are called sons of God. B'nai Elohim is the phrase that's used for angels, the sons of God. Individuals that are part of God's corporate economy, not every person, but the group can be called the Son of God. Israel was called God's son. Now, you have to be careful with that language because God was attributing that to them even though they weren't all individually sons in the sense that someone was in the New Testament. So there's a corporate way you can use that word to refer to a nation that is God's nation. And the reason I say you got to be careful is there's people in that nation that weren't the children of God. They were the children of the devil, like we talked about earlier. They were still part of that nation, but the corporate group was God's son. The angels are called sons of God. These are Old Testament examples. The only time you're really going to see, other than Adam, an individual human being, unless you're using Genesis 6 this way, as called a son of God, other than Jesus, and dependent upon how you interpret the 6th chapter of Genesis, I personally do not see any individual human in the entire Old Testament period, other than Adam, ever called a son of God, prior to the day of Pentecost. Prior to the day of Pentecost, there truly, I don't believe, were any human sons of God individually. You could call Israel that as a corporate group, and they were. God said to Pharaoh, "This is my son." Now, he wasn't talking about every person that was part of Israel. He was talking about the whole group.
I thought Israel was his wife.
Well, she was his wife. Isn't that strange? You want to talk about how God uses different metaphors. One place she's his wife. One place she's a young girl that he found, and he raised her up, and then he married her, and then she's his wife. But when he talked to Pharaoh, he referred to Israel as his son. Now, those are all the same thing. Just like the bride of Jesus Christ can have both men and women in it. It isn't a feminine group. It's odd how God uses these multiple different genders when he's referring to groups like that. But I personally do not believe, unless you're going to use Genesis 6, that there is an Old Testament example of an individual human called a son of God. I don't think that language is used for humans until Jesus, and then until the day of Pentecost, when people are born of the Spirit of God, and then they become sons and daughters of God. Then you suddenly start to see this language used of humans very regularly. This is what I told you to study. This is an interesting subject to study. Study how that word's used, how it's used of angels, how it's used of people, when it's used of people. Now, the one person I did qualify, Adam, is called the Son of God. And I'll tell you why I think that is. In one of the two genealogies of Jesus, it goes all the way back to Adam, and it says, Adam, the Son of God. And I think the reason it says that is because Adam was a direct spiritual creation of God, and no other human has been but Jesus. So when you narrow it down, until the day of Pentecost, I don't think any other human was a direct spiritual creation of God. But when God's Spirit indwells you and circumcises your heart and you become a new creature, you're now a direct spiritual creation of God. And you can now be called individually a son or daughter of God. By the way, the word son is gender neutral in this sense because when we talk about sons of God, we're referring to men and women. I don't want you to get confused by it. It's just that when they were referencing a group, they didn't refer to the men and the women necessarily, they refer to the men. But it covers the whole group. Now that said, you study out sons of God, you'll find out a lot of interesting things in the Bible. You'll also find out that there appears to be times that the term sons of God, or somebody that's a son of God other than Jesus, can be a son of God in different stages of sonship. Now what I mean by different stages of sonship, they are at a different level of maturity in terms of their sonship. I can give you several examples for that. This is one of them. This one says here, now we are the Son of God, but it doesn't yet appear what we are going to become. Do you realize near the end of Revelation, the last statement it makes, it's the 21st chapter of Revelation, it's the last statement it makes about the overcomers. It's right after it describes the New Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven as a bride adorned for her husband. Where's this statement? It's the 7th verse? I'm not looking at my Bible tonight. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I need to jog my memory.
He that overcomes shall inherit all
It is the 7th verse. He that overcometh shall inherit all things.
I will be his God.
I will be his God.
He shall be my son.
He shall be my son. Wait a second. So you've got to overcome to be a son of God? I thought you were a son of God when you were born again. That's proof all by itself. There's different levels of sonship. That son there is a whole different thing than somebody that was born again at the altar. This is a son that has come to full maturity.
You got the potential to be.
Well, when you're born, you are a son of God, but it's no different than Elijah back there. That little guy, we have no idea. Now, I don't want you to misuse this scripture, by the way, because I think this scripture is an instantaneous change Brother Stephen is talking about here. In that 3rd chapter, the 2nd verse, Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. I do think that's an instantaneous change, that you're going to be changed to be like him. That means you'll have a celestial body like him. That isn't talking about your morality being changed, because the 3rd verse is when your morality gets changed. The 3rd verse is you purifying yourself. Look, if your morality got dealt with at the resurrection, and it wasn't just a body change, it was not just a physiological change, but also a spiritual change, why even do the 3rd verse? Why not just lay back and wait for it? Why not just have a good time? Because when the resurrection comes, guess what's going to happen? Whatever your bad attitude is, whatever your problems are, whatever your issues are, it's all going to be fixed. You're going to be morally perfect. So why bother purifying yourself at all right now? See, it's nonsensical. The 3rd verse says, because we have this hope. What hope? If your hope was that God is going to purify me entirely when I wake up, no matter how bad I am when I go down, if that was your hope, why would that cause you to want to purify yourself now? See, the reason it says we purify ourselves as he is pure is because we've got a hope that if we do that, and if he completes the work in us, when we wake up to sleep no more, we'll be in a different body. The hope is the new body.
That's the bride making herself ready.
That's right. The bride makes herself ready. That's the 3rd verse, is an individual that is a bride member purifying themselves as Jesus is pure, because you've got to be like the husband. If you're not like your husband, he's not going to marry you if you're not like him. You've got to be like him. And then, because your heart has been changed to be like him, your body will be changed to be like him in the resurrection. So the heart changes in the 3rd verse, the body changes in the 2nd verse. Now I'm going to use this completely different, so don't get confused. But I've got a little boy back there. Some people, some days say he looks just like his daddy. Some days they say he looks like one of his sisters. You know, it depends on the day and how chubby his cheeks look that day, or how blue his eyes look, or whatever the other argument might be, whatever it might be about him, whether he's grinning or frowning or whatever, we'll let you figure out who grins or frowns like him, but we don't know what he's going to be yet, though. Now look, I don't want you to get confused, because his growth is progressive physically and spiritually. I don't know what he's going to look like when he gets older. Maybe he'll look like his dad. Maybe he'll look like one of his sisters. Maybe he'll look like his mom. Maybe he'll look like grandma. Maybe he'll look like grandpa. There's no telling who he might look like. We don't know what he's going to be yet. We don't know what he's going to be spiritually or physically. I pray to God he will be a godly young man spiritually. However he turns out physically is far less important. But our hope is to receive a new body, a physical change to get out of this dying condition we're in. And since that's our hope, we are striving to be more like Jesus so that we will receive that. That's what Paul was talking about to the church at Philippi when he said, not as though I'd already received, neither had already attained. He's talking about to the resurrection. But I press. You know what his pressing was? Purifying himself, even as he is pure. Paul's pressing that he was talking about to the Philippians is the purifying that these individuals were doing in this verse. I'm pressing. I'm purifying myself. I'm trying to live as clean a life as I can. I want to be like Jesus. Because that's my hope, is that if I will do everything in my power, and God does everything in his power, when I fall asleep, I'm going to wake up again to sleep no more. And when I wake up, I'll be in a new body. It won't have changed morally because I will have already changed morally. It's going to change physiologically. I'm going to be in a celestial body if I come up with that first resurrection. A body like Jesus' body. So you'll see him like he is. You'll be able to experience him. Let me tell you how much more there might be to that statement where it says, we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. What an unusual statement. Do you realize some of those people that John was writing to, John himself saw Jesus as he was in a glorified body? So what did John mean? Have you ever thought about that? This is deep, but I want you to think about this for a minute. Have you ever considered what John might have meant? We, he's including himself, will see Jesus as he is. John already saw him in his glorified body. So what does he mean by that? You know what I think he means? This is a little technical, and you have to read between the lines. I think that when you are in a new body, you'll have a level of capability in terms of your eyesight and other things far more powerful, far more all-encompassing than anything that you have in a human body. And you'll be able to actually see Jesus the way he looks to himself. Imagine what your vision would be like if you could see Jesus in all the color and dimension that Jesus exists in. We can't. We're in a limited human body. But a celestial body, I think, has the capacity to see a greater depth and dimension, and you can just start making a list. Colors may be more vibrant, details. I gave you that example when I was growing up, and any of you that have glasses can relate to this. I can still recall as a little child, I was probably about the age of Hallie, maybe when I first got glasses, maybe a little older. I can still remember. I had a certain concept of what Mom and Dad looked like. And when I put those glasses on for the first time, and I looked at Mom and Dad, it was hard for me to believe there were that many wrinkles and details in their skin. Made me feel guilty, to tell you the truth. I thought, did I do that? I might have. I probably did, especially with my mother. But it just struck me, is this really what we all look like? I'd rather have not seen this. I don't mean in terms of my parents, I mean even myself. I'd rather have not seen this. It was nicer when I couldn't see all these details, you know. Some of the details are nice. I'm riding down the road now and I can see a McDonald's 3 blocks away that I didn't even know existed before I had glasses. But some of those details were shocking to me. Now think about that in the reverse. Who knows how much of this creation around us we could see and be able to interact with if we had that kind of a body that we can't now. And what it would be like to suddenly have far greater than 20/20 vision. Far greater hearing and sensory input in terms of, look, there's no reason your body couldn't sense something from even further away than what you're tactilely touching. Imagine if your body was physiologically, I use that word a lot because it explains a big swath of things. Imagine if your body was physiologically changed in such a way that you could interact with the creation as God made it. As God sees the creation. Could you even imagine that? So when it says we shall see him as he is, some people spiritualize that, but I'm going to tell you, I think it literally means you'll be in a body like his. And when you look at him, you're going to see him for what he really looks like. Now, you and I haven't seen him at all in a literal sense, unless you've had a vision of Jesus, and it was literally Jesus, not just a vision. But John saw Jesus, and he was saying this. He said, we. He didn't say you who haven't seen him will see him like he is. He said, we shall see him like he is. What a strange thing to say if it didn't mean some more than just seeing him in his form that he was in when he was glorified after his resurrection. I think seeing him in a glorified post-resurrection form was probably incredible. But I don't think it's anything like what an angelic being would see when they looked at Jesus. And that's the kind of body and sensory devices you're going to have, I think, in that resurrection.
So what you're saying is that this corruptible has to put on incorruptible, right?
That's right. Now that's related to the capacity to have degenerative change. Physically, mentally. You know, it isn't just our physical bodies that can degenerate, it's our minds. Sometimes it's more horrible to watch someone's mind degenerate. When someone becomes senile or Alzheimer's or something takes hold of them, that's in some ways more horrifying than if they would just fall asleep. But all the degenerative issues that the curse causes will be ended, Ron. That's what it means for corruptible to put on incorruption, mortal to put on immortality. Is a person that puts on incorruption and immortality, there's nothing decaying and degenerating within them anymore, not in their mind, not in their body. How'd you like to have a mind that not only could not degenerate, but was operating on every level it could possibly operate on? The amount of information you could take in. See, there's part of all that interaction I'm talking about I think will happen. I personally think the level of knowledge, there's what someone would polyallegorize this, by the way, to say we know him as he is. You could say this too. I wouldn't argue this. You will know Jesus in the most intimate way possible. You'll know more about Jesus than anyone else knows. I wouldn't argue that's what this means. It might mean both. It might mean you'll know Jesus in a greater way than anyone has ever known him. I've used that scripture in one of the 7 churches when it says the overcomers, I will give them the hidden manna. Well, that means there's something about Jesus and something about these doctrines that not everybody is going to get. It's hidden.
I just wonder, do you think that when the Lord and the bride come back, that everyone will know exactly who they are and who he is?
You mean when they come back, as in the 19th chapter of Revelation? The whole world will know who Jesus is? I think by the end of the millennial reign, the whole world will know who Jesus is. I don't necessarily think it'll take that long for the whole world to know who Jesus is. I don't mean they'll accept him. Knowing who he is and accepting him are two very different things. Will everybody know who he is in a conscious sense that they say somebody is ascending from heaven in whatever form that happens? That's Jesus. And now it's communicated to every mind on the earth, that's Jesus.
It's kind of hard to...
I don't know.
There's not a lot of detail explaining how all that will
That's
happen.
the problem, Stephen. I can guess. In our world like we're at, there'll probably be half the world will think it's aliens that just came and invaded the earth for a little while.
What's it look like when the bride comes and take up their role as far as ruling and reigning with Christ? How that looks like? It's a wonder to me. It just there's not a lot of insight to that.
I would probably think there will be such a cataclysmic... See, the Battle of Armageddon, I think that will include waves of judgment that either will be part of it, that it all depends on how we use the 7 trumpets and 7 vials. Either will be part of it or will be the cascading effects that follow it that will completely cast down the governments of this world. When everything is in a state of complete chaos and uncertainty, you're going to have great and powerful men of God walking into that breach and saying, I have the answer to this. I can tell you what to do, and we can deliver you out of the condition you're in. And even that isn't going to completely unman the earth, because you see there in Zechariah 14 how even during the millennial reign, there's some of those nations that the warning goes out, they might not come up when they're told to come up to Jerusalem. If Egypt doesn't come up, it says, there won't be any rain on their land. If they don't come up for the Feast of Tabernacles to Jerusalem, I don't think that meant every Egyptian, by the way. I think that meant they don't send their representatives up. It'd be like having I don't think of this as a positive thing, but it'd be like a United Nations type of a gathering where everybody's expected to come up, and if you don't come up, you pretty much are on the outside. When they call for a feast or they call for some other activity to be going on at Jerusalem or at the center of God's government, if a nation doesn't send its representatives and show that it's submitted to that, judgment will fall on that nation. And it looks like that's not going to happen immediately. It looks like the potential is sitting there that some nations will say, I don't want to be a part of this. I'm not going to come up. And then there'll be no rain. There'll be other things. There's going to be a power. I think this is part of what's so mysterious to us. There's going to be a power exercised during the millennial reign that we have never seen on the scale or with the consistency. Now listen, what I mean by consistency is this. Elijah did one of these very things. One of the very things that are likely to happen during the millennial reign, Elijah did. Because of the debauchery and wickedness of Israel, Elijah prayed and the rain stopped on Israel for 3.5 years. That's pretty serious business. One man and God stopped Israel's cycle of rain for 3.5 years, and it did not return until Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal and the people chose the right God. And then Elijah had to pray again for the rain to come. And can you imagine what 144,000 Elijahs can do on this earth? If one Elijah could stop Israel from having rain for 3.5 years because they would not accept the true and only God, what will 144,000 Elijahs do? And when I say Elijah was a godly man, but Elijah wasn't on the caliber of a bride member. Just think about how much more powerful a bride member would be. We think how mighty men like Elijah and Elisha were, and they were good men. But they were not at the level of what a bride member is going to be in terms of purity and power. Imagine people that are super Elijahs, so to speak, forgive the word hyper Elijahs, people far more powerful, having far more knowledge and righteousness than even Elijah had, and 144,000 of them? That's just the bride, saints. That doesn't even take into consideration the 144,000 Hebrews. That's a massive number of people. You want to talk about bringing the governments of this world down on their knees. Elijah brought Israel to its knees. And it took 3.5 years. Do you realize God is going to have 288,000 governors like this, and he's going to have 1,000 years to bring the world to its knees. Elijah did it to Israel in 3.5, one man. So think about how powerful that exercise is going to be in terms of the changing of the guard, because that's what it's going to be. It's going to be a changing of the guard.
No wonder John said, doesn't appear what we shall be.
That's right.